Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law Podcast, brought to you by Digital Law and produced by Anson Evaluates. As a bit of background, we at Digital Law are a niche law firm specialising and working solely in technology and cybersecurity law sector. In each episode, we look at the recent stories in the news related to digital technology from around the world, with a specific emphasis on data protection and cybersecurity. For more information on the stories that we are covering this week, please check the links in our show notes. By way of an introduction, I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK, and I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright. Peter, will you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Amelia. My name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and the Managing Director at Digital Law, and lots to look at, even though it's not long since our last podcast to update you on, including things on TikTok and AI. So I'll pass back to Amelia to kick us off.
Thanks, Peter. So yes, we are going to be looking at the LinkedIn messages being used for AI training, the UK's digital document app, stolen phones, an epidemic, TikTok updates, and a personal data breach. But before we dive into today's stories, here's some background information on our podcast producer, Anson Evaluates. Anson Evaluates are a consultancy company offering a variety of services, including data protection training, outsourced data protection officer services, and specialising in advising clients over multiple jurisdictions. So, kicking off with our first story. This is the LinkedIn messages that are being used for AI training. So a US lawsuit filed on behalf of LinkedIn Premium users accused the social media platform of sharing their private messages with other companies to train artificial intelligence models. It alleges that August last year, the world's largest professional social networking website quietly introduced a privacy setting, automatically opting users into a program that allowed third parties to use their personal data to train AI. Well, there's quite a lot to unpack there. Firstly, you've got this applies to LinkedIn Premium users. So we're not talking about your average run-of-the-mill user. We are looking at those who actually pay for a higher service here.
Yes, and also we're only looking at those located in the United States as well. So we aren't thinking that this applies to those within Europe, Switzerland, or the UK. But the implication here is that those private messages, the direct messages that might be sent between users, where any LinkedIn user will know you tend to get messages that are sent to engage in conversation, but very often they are a bit salesy, and very often the premium users are the ones who can send out multiple messages to contacts they don't actually have a connection with.
Yeah.
So that means that your premium users will have been sending out more than likely a very high volume of direct messages, higher than standard users.
Yeah.
And in this instance, we're saying that those communications have been used to train AI. And this is one of the stories, I think, of the last 12 months or so, is that increasingly for AI systems to be trained, they need to be fed human-generated content. Given the fact that a lot of those direct messages will probably be AI-generated sales messages, might not necessarily train the AI in the way that you want to have it trained.
But there's the flip side of the coin, however. For example, this is the largest professional social networking website. So if you are connecting with someone to actually talk about business or business-related strategies, this actually might contain data that you don't otherwise want out in the world. For example, professional services, you are held to a higher level of data protection and care that you owe to other people.
Well, confidentiality.
Well, exactly, confidentiality. And that's just for highly regulated services. But if you're looking at even your standard user of LinkedIn, you may well be discussing business bits and pieces that still are classed as confidential. And if you're then using this to train AI, well, that just puts it in the main domain for everyone else.
Exactly. And increasingly, we're finding that a lot of organizations are either selling their content to AI platforms so they can train them, or content creators are actually getting quite upset when their content is used without their knowledge or permission. So there are, I think the New York Times is suing an AI platform in the States for the fact that New York Times articles were used without them knowing about it. Other news providers have done deals to have their content basically at least making some money out of that content before it's then sold.
Though, because in this article, we're looking at the fact that it quietly introduced these settings. There isn't that transparency there wherein LinkedIn has said, okay, right, look, guys, we're actually going to be training AI off your messages. Yeah. Please opt out here. No, it's been sort of quietly, gently snuck in, and if you didn't read the small print, you wouldn't know it's there. There we go.
Yeah, and it looks like there was they did basically sort of amend the privacy policy to say that they would be doing this. So they have tried to sort of comply with that need for transparency, but the class action that's been launched seeks to say that, look, US Federal Store Communications Act says that you cannot do what you're doing, and hence is seeking that $1,000 per premium user for the alleged violations. Would the volume, would the amount of money being sought here be a problem for LinkedIn? LinkedIn being a part of Microsoft, so probably not. This is more around the principle. It would be if the court gets hold of this and says, no, you shouldn't be doing that. It might give some AI platforms cause to stop and think, should we actually be? Because some AI platforms are signing deals, as has been done here, so that this platform thought that they'd signed a deal with Microsoft/LinkedIn to use these messages. Some AI platforms are just scraping data online and seeing if they can get away with it. But in this instance, it would be a bit of a sign to say to certain AI platforms, think carefully where you're getting your data from if you ended up with a court judgment definitively saying that's not how you should be doing it. Bear in mind, this is a piece of litigation that's just been launched. Bear in mind that it would take years to get anywhere. So by the time this gets decided, we might have artificial general intelligence and the world may be a very different place. And at the moment, OpenAI seem to think that AGI, artificial general intelligence, is but about 2 years away, by which point, who knows, the AI might not need training that much by that point because it will know everything anyway. Which isn't a scary thought.
But certainly an interesting story, and probably one that we will see mirrored through not necessarily legal action, but certainly others where you've got data scraping and training without necessarily consent.
Absolutely.
Moving on to our next story, we are looking at the UK Digital Document App. So essentially, it's looking at veterans' cards and driving licenses will be incorporated into a gov.uk wallet, which is being launched this year. The government is also testing a chatbot which could be added to the app, which would help people find answers to complex and niche questions. So kind of relates to our last story here, but takes it one step further, wherein you could have your kind of very personal identification documents all in one place. On the surface, great. I mean, for one, I'm always leaving my wallet at home. I use Apple Pay. Other payment providers are available, but I use Apple Pay for essentially everything. So I don't necessarily drag my ID around with me. And so having it on an app sounds good on the surface. But below that, maybe not so good. And I'll pass on to Peter to outline the questionable sides of this.
Well, let's start off. I'll try and be positive. So we're talking about sort of the increased digitization of government services. In the UK, we used to have this thing called road tax, where you used to have to go and tax your vehicle by walking into the post office, paying your cheque or cash over the post office counter, and be given a little circular disc which you had to display in your car windscreen, showing that your vehicle had been taxed. And if you didn't have that, there was the risk that the government would come along and put your car in a car crusher. That was all very straightforward and clear. That's one of the hoops you had to jump through to have a car. And that's one of the rites of passage you have, sort of age 17, you get your car, you get a driving license, and you have to go and get road tax. Now that's all done online. And the idea is that that's something that has been done online probably for a good 10 years, actually. And all the government's doing is then saying, well, look, let's have, along with your things like road tax, we can put things like your driving license and then potentially your passport and have all of that available online. I mean, this, for example, is something that I'm sure my wife, who's a US citizen, would find quite helpful because she has an indefinite leave to remain in the UK. She was given a little plastic card, credit card size, to say, I have indefinite leave to remain, which we use when we go through immigration. Bizarrely, it's not as crucial at the UK side of things because they know when she scans the passport that she has indefinite leave to remain, the US passport. The problem is actually leaving the States, where they were like, oh, you can't leave. And the reason I mention this is that card was valid for 10 years, and now that 10 years has expired, you don't get a new card. the information is simply kept online. So again, I think that's the sort of thing that you'd probably be able to have in your UK.gov digital wallet. So the idea of having all this information together in one place, I think, would be more convenient for people.
And there's also the fact that you'd be able to use it to buy age-restricted items like alcohol. So, for example, you could go into your Sainsbury's, your Asda, or wherever you get your alcohol from, or age-restricted products, and they'd actually recognise it, because this isn't the first person. The UK is not the first person to come up with this. There have been other service providers that have tried to actually do this, but the trouble was it didn't really catch on. So only certain people would recognise certain apps.
Yes.
And then it was like, well, great, you have this, but I can't go out to my local Wetherspoons and use this as ID because they don't accept it.
So at least this way, it would be potentially getting the market for dodgy student IDs will collapse, because literally people would say, well, if you've not got this, you're not getting your cigarettes or alcohol, basically. Yeah. So there are, I think, various advantages to it. Let's have a look at this. Stand back though. Obviously, they'll have to make sure this is very, very secure. But then the government has done that before with things like the NHS app. All your medical records and things like vaccination status. We're used now to that being available on the NHS app, and the big thing that drove take-up of that app to now the millions of people that use it is the fact that we had to get that if you wanted the QR code to prove you've been vaccinated back in the joyous pandemic 4 years ago. But that has 5 years ago, but that has sort of fed that digital take-up.
Yeah.
I don't think people would be used to having all that information on an app were it not for the pandemic. In the same way we wouldn't be used to working from home and having that flexibility in the same volume. Now, so with the app, obviously it'll have to be very, very secure. It also dictates that people will have to have a mobile device if you're going to use that app for ID purposes. And if you're going to access your digital wallet anyway, you didn't either need a mobile device or access to a PC or laptop, whatever, at home to be able to do this. And I know the government will be thinking, well, probably 80% of us have mobile devices or access online, but there is still a sizable minority out there of people who are either elderly or visually impaired, or I know people who actually work in the IT industry who don't carry smartphones because they do not trust them from a privacy perspective. So they're not going to be walking around using a digital ID.
And it's that level of modernisation, but let's not take modernisation to the extreme wherein you've not got a paper copy. For example, we have seen in recent years massive IT systems going down and everything going up the street because you can't function. We saw the Microsoft going down. So what happens if this app went down? I'd like to see that people were still accepting the physical copies of driving licenses, etc.
And that did happen again during the pandemic. At one point, there was a moment when the app did go down. So say you were going to the airport and you needed to be able to prove your vaccination status. If you hadn't printed the thing out and the app went down, you weren't getting on your flight, which did happen. The minute I heard of that, I'm sort of frantically then printing out things. So I
think the main thing here is not just because 80% of people do it, not restrict the accessibility of others where you've not always got access to digital services. Because, certainly I've got grandparents, and yes, while they can use a mobile phone and do have a mobile phone, can they use it efficiently? Absolutely not.
No. So I think the idea of doing digital first is fine. It's then a matter of saying, well, what's your alternative for those who are not going to be online? So making sure that, either it can or will be accepted if someone turns up with a document from their online wallet that they have printed. Does that then entitle them to be at least able to access services and do the things that they would otherwise want to do? That will be the thing they'll have to make sure. The other interesting thing is they're saying this will be up and running by the summer of this year, 2025. So having said that, let's see if they do it. Now, in fairness, on some projects like the NHS app and like some of the other digital things that have been done, they are used to delivering these things. So let's hope that it does happen on time and on budget. Let's see.
Yeah, I look forward to hopefully revisiting this in the summer, or maybe we can demonstrate this shiny new app. Who knows?
Yeah. And I suppose the final thing is that, let's not forget that the UK government has been when it came to company formation, I think we've been able to do that for about 20 years online now in the UK, whereas Germany, you only started being able to do that last year. So this could be, where they're going. I think they're following the model that's been set by, I think it's Estonia, as the Baltic state, that everything is done online and it's all digital first. So I think they're sort of following that lead. But who knows? I think it could be that where the UK government is going here, they're trying to follow. I'm trying to be positive on this. I'm trying to be positive. So let's say that. But obviously, I've also mentioned that yes, there are security and practicality considerations as well. Not to mention privacy and I say the vulnerability issues around vulnerable users. But there you go.
We can unpack that nearer the time, when it's summer, we've got this lovely new app. I'm sure we can pick it apart then, but for the time being, we'll keep it light and positive.
Yes. Yeah.
I say that and then go into the next story.
Keep it light. Stolen phones. Go on.
Stolen phones, an epidemic. So the UK's most senior police officers accused tech giants, including Apple and Google, of enabling a phone theft epidemic that gangsters have turned into a global criminal business. I mean, so much for that positivity here. But essentially, about a third of all activity by organised crime groups in London now revolves around stolen smartphones and other thefts. They're making a fortune out of this, said Sir Mark Braunsley, the Met Police Commissioner. The organised crime business model is enabled by the reusability and resaleability of stolen phones. I think a lot of people are aware now that going to London and other big cities, that you do have that level of pickpocketing and thievery, because if you have your phone out, it's quite an easy target for someone to just swipe out your hand and trot off somewhere.
Indeed, and I always think it's if you are sometimes used to, particularly when you're in a somewhere that you might not be familiar with, and you're thinking, where am I? And you're trying to use Google Maps to navigate. Absolutely, use the technology, but don't do it in the visible way of walking around with your mobile device in front of you.
Or you've got the flip side where, we are in an age of influencing, TikTok, Instagram, all of that jazz, and people are out there just recording videos in the street. Absolutely fine. But you do sort of leave yourself wide open for someone to come along and nab your phone whilst recording. And it does happen, and increasingly so, as kind of demonstrated here. But our focus is on the fact that it's quite easy. I say easy, but you can take a phone and there is a very popular market for reselling it.
Yes.
And that is a big problem. I mean, specifically thinking about the last story. So someone has taken the phone. It's got this lovely app on it with driving license, your ID, where you live. That's quite a big problem if someone can then get access to that.
Yes.
And there is, obviously that's not currently an app that is existing, but there are a lot of documents that someone can have on their mobile phone. If you've got, for example, you took a lawyer's work phone, you could have a number of bits and pieces on there. Whether that's appropriate or not, we won't go into. But nonetheless, there is a clear issue here.
Yes, and so the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, is saying, look, tech companies are showing, we've got security measures in place on phones, but he's saying, well, it's clearly not enough, because if they were enough and you could basically disable a phone once it had been stolen, well, there wouldn't be this roaring market in phone theft that he is aware of, in particularly from London, but other metropolitan areas as well. It does seem that a sizable number of these phones, when they're stolen, go overseas. A lot of them, according to the Met, are going to China, where they're then broken down and the parts are reused. Or it could be that they're then being taken by organised crime gangs, used for various different purposes, resold, or exported to different markets around the world. And the argument from the Met is that, look, we need to make sure there is proper technology so that you can wipe and remove your data from these phones and indeed put them beyond use. And his feeling is that if that was the case, it might act as the deterrent to the crime in the first place. And in the meantime, I think the point is, as you say, Amelia, is thinking about, if you are in an urban area, don't walk around with your phone out. I almost was a victim to that at the weekend. I was out hiking in the country, so you can end up walking for miles using the GPS on a phone to make sure you aren't lost.
Yeah.
But then you suddenly find yourself in an urban area as you rejoin civilization. And if you are then used to walking around with your phone, as I was at that point, and suddenly, boom, someone goes past you on an e-bike or something, you think, oh, that could have been my phone gone at that point.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't even aware the person was there, given that I'd got headphones in, listening to a podcast, world of my own, and then suddenly, bang, that web past, and look, oh, actually, yeah, I probably should put this away. But that highlights the risk that you need to be careful when you're walking around using the mobile device. And let's face it, we've just talked about, as you said, that article where you're using the app, your phone for so many things. So you could be looking at a rail ticket, you could be scrolling to the next podcast, checking your bag, who knows what it is. But more often than not, we actually do have the phone out and you're hunched over looking at the thing. And that means that it's then potentially at risk from someone nabbing it. So you don't want your phone to become another statistic, do you?
No. That leads us quite nicely onto our next story. We're talking about influencers and having their phone next, and we're on TikTok. I mean, if you were listening to our last podcast, you'd have heard that the TikTok ban was going to be coming into force. Well, it did come in and then swiftly got sent out the door again. So I believe that TikTok was shut down Saturday evening, but then came back on Sunday, and Trump has now signed a 75-day extension on the ban. But it's a little bit more interesting just than on the face of it. So, Peter, what do you think about the kind of tech lookout here, and the fact that actually a lot of tech companies like Instagram, Facebook, they all collect a large amount of data. What is the difference here?
So the architecture of how the app works is very similar actually to the data collection practices of Meta, Snap, various others, in that they are collecting huge amounts of data from the handset, and then they're squibbling that away very often to servers that are in China and elsewhere. Basically, they just, it's going to be using fairly cheap cloud storage wherever and whenever they can get it. And there's always been this concern that, this data is going off to China. Well, okay, with Meta, they're collecting the data and it might go off to California or wherever they're taking it, very often to servers out, across the US and sometimes further afield. There's data centers being built beyond the Arctic Circle because it's nice and cold. So sometimes your data can end up there. Sometimes Meta's pretty opaque about where your data is going as well, which is another reason why you don't really want to be using their platforms for business-related activities if you're running a highly regulated organization. So anything like law, finance, accounting, medicine, you don't want to be using WhatsApp for that. Just putting that out there. I know we say it quite often, but saying it again, just for the avoidance of doubt. TikTok, it's the fact that, that data is going to China. There is a national security law in China that says that if the Chinese government asks a Chinese company for something, that data has to be provided. Chinese government's always said, we would never make that request. ByteDance has always said, we would never provide it. But, well, if that is the case, why is that law there? That's all I'll say on that one. There's then the fact that, the UK National Cybersecurity Centre and the American National Security Agency, NSA, have both spent a long time looking for a sort of smoking gun, a definitive national security reason that they can point to and say, this thing is a national security risk and that's the reason why we should ban it. And in fairness, they've never actually found it. That didn't stop America from drafting the legislation that was passed by Congress last year by a comfortable majority, so that meant bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans.
A rare agreement there.
They haven't agreed on much over the course of the last couple of administrations, but that was one thing that was agreed. At the time that legislation went through, and in fact, just before then, there'd been a fresh wave of concerns around sort of what data is this app collecting, what's it being used for, which meant that it was in this. A lot of governments said, do not have this on your public sector mobile device. So if you work for, the Department of Energy, don't have this on your mobile device. America did that, and then the federal government did that, and then that was followed at state level by a lot of US states, and it was also followed by the European Union and also by a lot of Western governments. So the British government said, if you've got a British mobile device, issued by the government or government agency, do not have TikTok on it. But I'd say that they've never sort of found a definitive, and this is the reason why. There's been various concerns about, if TikTok was great for children and young people to use, why isn't it available in China? That's always a very good question. They have their own version of it from ByteDance in China, but that isn't the same TikTok that's available elsewhere. So that means that the all-powerful algorithm is being fed on international users' data. You have influencers on there that you don't have on the Chinese version. The Chinese version, you can only use the infinite scroll, I think, for about half an hour, and then it's locked, and you have to come back the next day. Whereas, anecdotally, you hear of children doom scrolling and being exhausted when they come to school because they spent all night on TikTok, flicking through, with what is still remains probably one of the world's most powerful algorithms, just serving you more and more and more of the content that your brain is asking for.
Yeah. And I think it's quite interesting as well, the fact that it's worth mentioning the amount of people that are now looking to buy it, because that was just it. The ban would not necessarily go ahead if they had found a buyer.
Yeah.
And so you've got many people throwing their hats in the ring, including Musk, which I don't think anyone's surprised about. But then you've got a few others that are also throwing their hat in the ring for this. And it's like, okay, interesting. Is this then a different sort of ploy in terms of, okay, we will keep this massive TikTok algorithm on US soil? And because not to forget that Trump when he was running for president again, he was using social media as a massive tool and then looking to appeal to the younger generation through the likes of TikTok. So is there a little bit of politics actually involved in the ban? It's quite an interesting thing.
Very much so, because President Trump in his first administration was one of those who tried to ban it by an executive order. Yet one of his first acts last week was to sign an executive order granting this stay of execution for 75 days, which will take them through to about the 4th of April, is our reckoning. If that extends from the 19th of January, which was the original cut-off date, at 75 days into that takes you to the 4th of April. Now, so the political side to it is that I think Trump realized that if you're going to reach out to certain demographics, TikTok was the vehicle to do that, as well as doing things like appearing on the Joe Rogan podcast and various other things. But because he's had this massive engagement on TikTok, he's then thought, oh, well, this actually is really good. It's one of the reasons why I was able to reach out to people. So then being the guy upon whose watch it then gets switched off, he suddenly thought, maybe I don't want to do that. The US legislation always allowed for TikTok to carry on, provided that the US users, 170 million of them, that was sort of hived off from ByteDance TikTok and was sort of hived off into a US TikTok that would be US owned and run and servers based in America. They said that would be fine. TikTok said you can't do that. You can't hive off part of a system that's been built globally. I'm sure Meta would say the same thing. They couldn't sort of hive off different parts of Facebook or WhatsApp in that way. It simply isn't built to do that. So once this legislation was passed, there was talk that Steve Mnuchin, who was the former US Treasury Secretary, was going to head up a consortium to buy the US arm. It quickly fell apart because ByteDance said, no can do, we can't do that. Plus the Chinese government, there is a law that says Chinese algorithms can't be sold outside to Chinese companies, to companies that are not Chinese.
Yeah.
So that algorithm ain't leaving mainland China. And they don't want the US to have access to it proprietorially. So that's why then there was this rumor that would it be Elon Musk? And apparently, the only person the Chinese might consider selling it to would be Musk because he has extensive business interests in China. The world's largest Tesla factory is there. And, a lot of the SpaceX stuff is built there. A lot of the Tesla equipment is sourced there. The long supply chains to all of this stuff is all coming from China. He regularly meets with President Xi. He knows people within the Chinese government. So arguably, if they were going to sell to someone, it would be Elon Musk, and he'd probably just then set up a Chinese business that would be TikTok. And we aren't talking about selling the US arm. I think we'd be talking about him buying all of TikTok and then running it, but probably keeping it as a Chinese business. It might still have the problems, but it would have Elon Musk's face on it.
Because the grey area of loopholes there. But I think it's definitely one where it's a watch this space. I don't think we're going to have a podcast yet where we're not going to talk about TikTok because let's face it, there's that much coming out about it daily in terms of updates and news, but certainly there's no clear kind of headway with this.
No, and just tying it back to why are we talking about it from a law and technology perspective, it's the fact that it's a platform with millions of users internationally. It's a platform that does collect huge amounts of personal data. Like a lot of these platforms, it has policies around the collection and use and storage and transmission of that data that aren't really understood by the vast majority of its users. And I say that because people don't really understand what happens to data from Apple or from Meta or Google. So they're all doing the same thing. But it was interesting that the chief executive of TikTok, Suzy Chu, was at the presidential inauguration and sort of stood next to that sort of the wall of tech moguls behind Trump that included Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Tim Cook and various other leaders. Zuckerberg was there as well. And next to him was Suzy Chu. So he was another of these figures that was there. And he probably had donated to the inauguration. I think you basically had to donate that to be in the rotunda that day. So yeah, it just means that I think they're sort of fighting to get this bit of acceptance from the Trump administration. And now let's see what happens within the next 75 days. So April the 4th is the next thing to put in your diary. This thing hasn't gone away. Something will have to happen between now and the 4th of April.
Thanks, Peter. Moving on to our final story of the podcast, we are looking at the school's personal data breach. So a head teacher has apologised after hundreds of pupils' private data was shared with 2 parents. So Wellsway School in Keynsham near Bristol has been reported to the ICO after 86,000 lines of sensitive information was shared by email to a couple. They were sent the data after they submitted an FOI request because they felt the secondary school's withdrawal room was being used excessively. The school said it had immediately followed through with all procedures and informed parents when it became aware of the data breach. But it was only after having a spreadsheet of data for a few weeks that the couple who wished to remain anonymous realised it contained comprehensive data on children. I mean, crikey, there's a lot to unpack here. You've got an accidental sharing of data, and we're not talking about a little bit, we're talking about 86,000 lines. The fact that this was sent in a response to an FOI, and then following up with the fact that it was sat on for a couple of weeks and no one noticed. Interesting.
Yeah. So, indeed, let's just break that into a few key points. Number one, when it comes to responding to FOI requests, and indeed things like subject access requests, we spend a lot of time working with our clients to say, be incredibly careful when you're sending out these responses. That you aren't just, doing a bulk collection of huge amounts of personal data or documents and just sending it out. It has to be reviewed. It has to be redacted to remove things like third-party personal data. If someone had looked at this disclosure pursuant to an FOI request and thought, oh, I shouldn't have third-party personal data in there, the most basic rule you can have, this wouldn't have happened. So clearly that didn't happen. And this is at a school that is collecting and responsible for large volumes of pupil data.
Then you've got the fact that exploring exemptions within FOIs and DSARs, because in actual fact, sometimes there are reasons why certain information cannot be disclosed.
Exactly.
So it's also kind of considering those and exploring those in more detail. Then you've got the fact that because this is one of the few times where we're looking at a breach where it's not been done by a nefarious individual. This is the unfortunate happenings of maybe poor training or poor understanding, where the poor secretary or whoever's had to have sent this out has said, right, I'll get on with this. I have a loose understanding. This is what needs to be sent. There you go. It's been sent. Jobs are given.
Yeah.
And that's where they've kind of fallen at the hurdle. It's not that they've been hacked. It's that lovely human sat behind the computer that's made the error.
And a slight concern that the administrator and the school didn't realise the mistake for a long period of time and would not have done had the recipient of the data then not notified them and presumably the ICO as well. And it's then the fact that this is data that if you were the school collecting that, and this is actually all data about disciplinary processes, so who's been
we've got names,
kept in isolation, and
list of any special educational needs, educational healthcare and plans. So you can be looking at medical data here as well. And then I believe there was also information about specific child protective orders as well. And so you've got child protection orders and whether they're eligible for free school meals. So you've got a lot of special category data there, as well as the data naturally being more sensitive because it's about children. It's just like, crikey, why is this continuing to happen? And the easy fix is to train. Train people and actually make sure they do understand data protection and the key concepts that apply to their role as well, because it's all well and good, death by PowerPoint, here's an overview of all the data protection. And while you do need to know an overview and you do need to have an understanding, you also need to be able to apply it to roles within your organization. Because if you say to, I don't know, someone higher up that has absolutely no access to the data and give them all this great deal amount of training, great, but are they going to actually be able to use it and apply it? Who knows?
And this is actually also typifying the fact that very often it is, unfortunately, it's very difficult, I think, for, say, those who are administering schools, academy trusts, NHS trusts,
Charities.
GP surgeries, charities. They are the ones, unfortunately, who are at the front line dealing with the large volume of these requests and are then likely to make these sort of mistakes through a misunderstanding as to how the law should be applied and what should or shouldn't be being disclosed.
And they are easily avoidable.
Yes.
And I think that's what you should take away from this, is the fact that be really careful when you get these through. And if in doubt, seek expert advice. There's that lovely plug there, seek expert advice.
Yeah.
If you are really concerned, particularly if you've got, 86,000 lines of data here, if you're concerned about sharing that amount of data, ask for advice, because you're not going to get told off for asking for advice.
This is one of the reasons why we provide an outsourced DPO service, which is availed of by organisations large and small, who would rather we worry about this for them so that they don't have to.
And there's the plug. There we go.
Indeed. We don't do it often. We try not to, but there you go. Far easier just to have paid either a small fixed fee to us to handle it for you, or be paying a small amount each month for us to take all of this stuff away from you so you don't have to worry.
Rather that than a large fine from the ICO, that's for sure.
And the rather negative and regrettable publicity on bbc.co.uk.
Exactly. So that was our last discussion of the episode. And if you have any questions about what we have talked about today, please email us at admin@digitallawuk.com. A summary of today's stories are available on our website, as well as the links to the original stories containing more information. And if you'd like to hear more from us, including information about subscriber-only podcasts, webinars, and events, then please subscribe to Premium via our Patreon channel using the link in the show notes. A big thank you to Answer and Evaluate for helping to produce this podcast. And if you're interested to hear more about Answer and Evaluate's services, please take a look at their website that you can find at www.answerandevaluate.com. And just a reminder, these episodes are available on our website, YouTube channel, and podcast channels such as Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, essentially anywhere you can find a podcast. And please feel free to leave us a review. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.